Their leader, Jesus of Nazareth, had just been executed.
The disciples are terror-struck. They don't know what to do.
12 men in fear for their lives.
I was just looking at the group being composed. I'd say disaster area.
Yet these terrified men became the founders of a worldwide faith.
None of them ever expected it to turn out the way it did.
Modern science can now help us understand how 12 ordinary men from the backwaters of Galilee could end up as giants of history, the disciples. The disciples spread Jesus' message across the ancient world. Many of them sacrificed their lives for it. The transformation of this tiny, threatened group into a world religion is a remarkable story. But to understand it, we need to trace their journey from the very beginning. The story starts as the first century dawns in Galilee. Jesus and the disciples are still just children, when a band of men protesting about rising taxes and Roman rule stage an uprising in the key city of Sepphoris.
The Romans immediately put down the revolt with complete destruction of the city and killed all the inhabitants or sold them as slaves. And it must be a memory which the locals kept for generations.
In fact, during the first century, Galilee was a hotbed of rebellion. Helen Bond has studied this social and historical background to the Bible.
We know there were quite a lot of bandit leaders at about the time of Jesus. We hear of people taking to the hills and going and living in caves, and where other people came to them and they led resistance movements against the Romans.
The disciples grew up against this background. Some may even have witnessed the Sepphoris rebellion. Perhaps in Jesus they saw a leader who could free them from the Romans. Historical breakthroughs are giving us new insights into the lives of the disciples. The picture that's emerging is vivid and surprising. One thing's clear from the outset. The disciples came to Jesus for a set of very different reasons and with very different hopes. By the time they were in their 20s, the first of those reasons may have been financial. Hefty taxes would have been a constant concern for the 4 disciples who worked as fishermen. John, brothers Peter and Andrew and James.
We know that James and John, Peter and Andrew were in a partnership from the Gospels, from Luke. So they are under a lot of pressure to catch the fish in order that they meet their obligations, both to feed the families and to pay the tax collector.
The fishermen were forced into a contract with the tax collector to hand over their catch, including fresh fish like carp and sardines, in return for inferior salted fish. It was an unfair exchange bound to breed resentment.
All of the fish have been counted from the catch, and the agents of the tax collector come and take that away to go to some of the tables of the rich people in the city. In return, the fishermen are going to receive, as a part of their contract, processed fish, probably salted fish. And the feeling that they have at that moment must be, we can't eat our own take.
This amounted to enormous financial pressure. People longed for more control over their lives. They were looking for a leader to help them fight back. Maybe they thought that leader was Jesus.
The initial followers of Jesus were attracted to something very practical that dealt with daily life, that dealt with real issues. We would misconstrue it to call it a purely religious movement.
While some of the disciples may have joined the Jesus movement to challenge taxes, it doesn't explain why all 12 joined. In particular, it doesn't explain Matthew. Before he became a disciple, Matthew was a tax collector. We know about his job from the Gospels, but they don't tell us why he was attracted to Jesus. For one thing, unlike the fishermen, Matthew lived the comfortable life of a wealthy man. James Strange is an archaeologist whose excavations of ancient villages have helped to paint a picture of life in the first century.
People who lived in any village in the Galilee, their houses from the outside would look absolutely identical. The only way you could have a luxury good would be inside the house. You might plaster a room very finely and paint it very nicely, but that's only for those inside the house. No one outside would have any idea unless they were invited in.
The inside of Matthew's house would have shown that he was far wealthier than his neighbors.
If Matthew were a low-level tax official and only had a few villages assigned to him, he would still be richer than anybody else in any of those villages.
But his wealth would have made Matthew a hated figure in his community. Every day he would have faced an uphill struggle just to get the job done. Richard Horsley is particularly interested in the economic side of life in first century Galilee. He's found that tax was paid in produce rather than money, and that the Galileans would have devised ways of limiting how much they handed over.
Over the centuries, peasants have developed clever ways of avoiding heavy taxes. Let's say this is the amount of grain that's owed to the tax collector. Peasant brings it in, puts it on the scales. The tax collector sees that it's just the right weight. But then when we look inside the basket, see what's actually in there, sure enough, it's grain, but at the bottom, sticks and stones. And by that device, the peasant was able to save some of the grain that he otherwise would have owed to the tax collector.
This daily confrontation could have been the spur for Matthew to join Jesus.
He would be really utterly alone. I mean, it would be very difficult for him to find people to have just ordinary socializing with. He'd be in a very precarious position. And I imagine, to tell you the truth, that he would probably also have to have bodyguards.
By joining Jesus, Matthew turned his back on tax collecting and was welcomed, maybe for the first time, into a community. Perhaps an even more puzzling disciple than Matthew is Judas Iscariot. Judas has a bad reputation, untrustworthy and disloyal. But ironically, he was the group's treasurer, looking after donations to the group and organizing provisions.
So here you have this band of disciples. They're living out of some kind of a common fund, and he apparently is the bursar. He handles all the accounts, keeps track of what we need. A quartermaster, if you, I think it involves some organizational ability, some trustworthiness, some leadership.
So far from being the bad boy, when Judas joined the Jesus movement, he must have been regarded as one of its most reliable members. Unfortunately, we know very little about the remaining disciples. There's Thomas and Philip, who's said to come from the same area as the fishermen. There's a Bartholomew and a Simon, known as the Zealot, probably because he was very strict about upholding Jewish religious law. But there is a controversial theory that Simon, along with Jude and another disciple called James, were actually Jesus' brothers. They may have been stepbrothers rather than blood relatives. Nevertheless, some experts believe that they were part of Jesus' family.
The brothers of Jesus that are named in the Gospels turn out to be, lo and behold, James, Simon, and Jude. I think we have to entertain at least the possibility, since Jesus, when he dies, passes on the control of his community to his own brother James.
Whatever the blood ties between Jesus and some of his disciples, it's clear that these 12 men were very different from one another. Such variety might make an interesting group, but you'd think a radical movement such as this would need like-minded recruits. Cary Cooper specializes in group psychology. We asked him to apply modern psychological principles to what we know about the disciples, to find out how hard it would be for such a group to work together and become founders of a new faith.
When I look at the disciples, I would have thought, as a psychologist, if I was just looking at the group being composed, I'd say disaster area. Coming from totally different kind of backgrounds, a tax collector, people who are revolted by the taxes, a zealot, all sorts of different characters, very different. Now, if they had a leader that could kind of resolve their differences and the potential conflicts that are going to come on board, and got them to think about what the ultimate objective is and how that objective could meet their own personal needs, then it would work.
These 12 men from such diverse backgrounds did have a strong leader in Jesus, and they had a mission. They may have been prepared to give working together a chance if it meant they would see some action against the Romans. But following Jesus was never going to be easy. There's evidence that traveling together as a group may have been a harsh enough experience in the first century to put these very different personalities to the test. Galilee is about 35 miles across. The disciples could walk it in a day or so, but the terrain can be rugged. In these places there was little protection from the elements or from robbers.
Life on the road is quite hard, actually. There are people who regard that as their territory sometimes, and they don't like you coming through. There are wild animals you have to think about. In the ancient world, actually lions and bears were the two prime predators you had to think of.
As if life on the road wasn't dangerous enough, the Bible records that Jesus told the disciples to leave their possessions behind. Even so, there are some basics that experts believe they would have needed.
For example, in very bad weather, you really need a wool mantle like this to dress yourself in. You can wrap it tightly about yourself and sleep in it like a tent. You can also use it as a raincoat because it is impervious to water. If someone is not friendly and has not given you fire, you have to have a way to make fire. You'll need a piece of iron and a piece of flint and a scorched piece of linen so that you can nap your own fire. Otherwise, you're in a terrible position. Now, in terms of security, you might need to defend yourself from wild animals, from predators. Here is a sword. It's rather small, but you get the idea. When Jesus is arrested, two of the disciples have swords. You can put this then on a belt around your thigh underneath your clothing.
If the disciples did leave everything behind to follow Jesus, even something as fundamental as finding food could be a problem. There's a clue in the Bible as to how they fed themselves. In one story, they are said to take grain from a field. This may sound as though the disciples turned into thieves, but Jewish law made provision for the poor, including travelers.
If you have a field, because you're a landowner, and you're harvesting the field, you have to leave bits with the sort of the corner of the field untouched so that the poor can come and collect from it.
One of the most important things that you have to do in ancient Judaism is practice hospitality. And part of the reason for this is very simple. You're at the mercy of people when you're traveling. There are no hotels, there are no inns, there are no nothing. So both in Jewish law and in Jewish custom, you practice hospitality.
When they traveled, the disciples left behind more than their livelihoods. Many had other responsibilities.
Most of the disciples seem to have been married. We certainly know that Peter was married. And I think it would have been very difficult for his wife and children left behind. The disciples were the people who brought in the money. They were the ones who caught the fish or who worked on the land. And I think it would have left the families in very, very difficult circumstances.
However, we may be wrong to assume that once they left, they never returned.
We have a number of references to them going out, and it couldn't be more than a few days, and then they come back again. So I don't think we should picture it as a lot of the movies and popular books have the idea. He's always on the road, day and night, just traveling from the day he starts till the day he dies. There's lots of time in between.
The disciples and Jesus may have gone home at night.
We do have the story of Peter, who's called by Jesus. He leaves everything, and then only a few verses later, he's going to have tea with his mother-in-law. And so that gives the impression that maybe the break, at least in the early period when Jesus' ministry was located in Galilee, maybe the break wasn't quite so clear-cut as we're often led to believe.
As Jesus' ministry grew, there were occasions when the disciples had to travel well beyond Galilee. On these journeys, they really did have to rely on the hospitality of strangers. But it's a little-known fact that the disciples had something to offer in return. Something that was much sought after and rarely available.
When we dig up tombs, most people in the tombs in their 40s and 50s when they die. And the mortality rates look like they do for third world nations today, because after all, a very ordinary infection could simply kill you because they had no way to deal with that.
There was no formal health system in first century Galilee. Villagers depended on local healers who had developed home cures that seemed to work. Jesus had a big reputation as a healer, but so too did his disciples.
If they went to a village, they seemed to have two main tasks. One was to announce the kingdom of God was upon you. The other was to heal the sick. And if they successfully healed the sick, then they could have their daily bread. They might have a place to lay their heads.
The fact that the disciples could heal should not come as a surprise. Faith healing has a long history. For centuries, it was the only healing people had.
It's not at all unusual to pray to the gods if you're a pagan, or to God if you're a Jew, for healing. That's absolutely acceptable. And people who specialize in praying to God for healing are also very well known. But delivering healing and delivering it in association with a religious movement would be perfectly understandable and acceptable.
Now modern medicine may be able to explain how it can work.
lateral, so we need to go higher and lateral.
In Houston, Texas, surgeon Bruce Mosley treats patients with arthritic knee pain. In a recent experiment, he treated 3 different groups. All patients were taken down to the operating room and had incisions made in the knee. But only the first group received routine surgery. The second group had a smaller operation, and the third had no treatment at all. The results of the experiment were quite remarkable.
They all improved, they all got benefit from the surgery, they all reported less pain, they all reported improved function, and they were all very satisfied. But interestingly, the pretend surgery group did just as well as the real surgery groups.
Tim Perez was one of Dr. Mosley's first patients.
Well, I could be walking and a sharp pain would hit my knee, and it give, you know, when you're in pain, you just don't have no strength at all.
Tim was in the group that had no surgery, but his knee got better. That was 8 years ago, and Tim still feels better.
And I call that a miracle because it's something that didn't take no medicine, didn't take nothing to heal it. So it had to be the mind.
In medical terms, Tim was part of the placebo group, which means he didn't receive a real treatment. Physicians are now closer than ever to understanding how the placebo effect works.
I think the placebo works through a psychological or an emotional impact that a treatment has on a patient. And it ties into what the patient's expectations and beliefs are. If the patient expects and believes that a treatment's going to be effective, it almost certainly will. And now hands in front, up over your head as high as you can go. Okay.
And if people today can get better because they believe in the doctor's ability to cure them, maybe the same was happening back in the first century. Dr. Mosley still believes God was involved in the disciples' healing, but he does not discount the importance of the patient's belief that they can be cured.
You can certainly draw parallels between what Jesus and the disciples were doing and what a doctor does today. In both situations, they have a belief that the healer is going to help them. And you could certainly imagine that some of the benefit that the ancient healers have had is from a placebo effect.